The cultural importance of restoration. Restoration is often seen as a purely environmental effort, but culture often has a significant connection to nature. Environmental restoration should therefore have a cultural component to it. The cultural importance of restoration. Restoration is often seen as a purely environmental effort, but culture often has a significant connection to nature. Environmental restoration should therefore have a cultural component to it. Biodiversity is the variety and amount of plants and animals in an ecosystem. Diversity is counted as everything from fungi in the soil and the smallest plants to the largest trees and top predators in an area. All of these components are critical to the health of an ecosystem. The removal or significant degradation of any aspect of an ecosystem has the capability to affect the health of the overall system, as many components of an ecosystem are often intertwined, in both ways we can see and understand and ways we have yet to discover. Having more biodiversity allows an ecosystem to be more resilient to change, as a diverse ecosystem works as a larger bank of genetic material and information, which provides the best chance for adaptations to a changing environment in the long term. Cultural diversity is the variety of different ways of living and interacting with the surrounding environment. Every culture varies slightly, if not dramatically, in the way it interacts with the world and what's important to that culture. They each have a unique way of thinking and unique practices. Cultural diversity is important as it allows for new ways of thinking about issues and unique solutions to local and global problems. There's a danger to losing these cultures as we risk loss of information and loss of solutions to problems that may not be obvious to the predominating culture. With a single culture, you may have only one set of values and only some things may be important to that culture. With a variety of cultures, we as a society can come up with more well-rounded looks at the world and be able to place value on more of what we interact with. A diversity in culture lets us better understand the world around us and how we can interact with it and the possible consequences of our interactions. Biocultural diversity is the meeting of these two ideas, biologic and cultural diversity. It takes into account all life both in human worlds and natural worlds. Biocultural diversity is important as these two worlds do not exist in a vacuum. We as people exist in nature and shape it to our needs, which has high impacts on the natural world. Biocultural diversity is the measure of diversity among human and natural worlds. We find high levels of biodiversity in the same areas that we find high levels of cultural diversity. They seem to be connected. A diverse environment creates a diverse way of interacting with that environment. We are currently experiencing massive amounts of loss of biocultural diversity. Some of the largest contributors to this loss are modern agriculture and rapid urban expansion and development. Culturally significant sites are often swallowed up while expanding both the agricultural industry and urban areas. Very biologically diverse places are also destroyed or fragmented to allow space to harvest resources for these practices. Cities and their infrastructure take up huge amounts of land and natural resources. Forests and wetlands are often cut down or converted to be agricultural land. Agriculture is a necessity for humans. At our current population levels, we cannot sustain ourselves by only harvesting wild food. We cultivate food by creating artificial conditions for it to grow in and completely manage its life cycle. We control the way it grows and its interactions with the environment through pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers. We have also changed it on a genetic level with genetically modified organisms, which is anything that has been modified artificially on a genetic level, but also transgenic crops, where we have introduced unrelated DNA into an organism to make it more suited to a large-scale agricultural operation. Hybrids are also created for the same purpose and are artificially created to suit the needs of agriculture. Agrobiodiversity is also being reduced, with the large use of artificial inputs and strict monocultures. One variety of crop is planted and everything else is killed off to protect that crop. One of the main issues with these practices is the loss of genetic diversity that exists within the cultivated crops. The crops are now often now have one set of DNA with little to no variance, which may allow it to grow very well in the exact conditions that it was meant to be produced in, but will not allow it to survive any changes to the environment. If anything were to happen that would no longer allow these specific conditions and the specific crops to grow, we risk losing the crop completely. as there's no diversity to help ensure its survival after large environmental change. Many crops have also been genetically engineered to be sterile to preserve copyrights on genomes, which means that the crops are unable to respond to the environmental changes or evolve. There is an effort to preserve this genetic diversity with seed banks. The seed banks preserve seeds in a stagnant environment. If a crop seed is stored for long enough, its original environment may no longer be able to host it, as they are genetically frozen in time and don't adapt to changing conditions. It may also be hard for native people who have cultural connections to that crop to be able to withdraw the seeds, and they may lose that connection. These cultures have for a long time either wild harvested these species, meaning they harvested what was available to them naturally, or para-cultivated them, meaning they existed naturally, but the native peoples created rules and practices to support its propagation. With these practices, a diverse number of crops became culturally significant to them, and their lives evolved around these species. Urban development creates large areas of land that are used intensely by humans. We often replace areas that are rich in species and pave over them for development. Urbanization has secondary consequences by demanding more and more resources not available in the quantities needed locally. Urbanization reduces the amount of species that are able to survive in the area by depleting resources or habitat for species that don't thrive in an urban environment. Urban development also contributes to habitat fragmentation by creating barriers to animal movement such as roads or neighborhoods. This reduces the habitat species can use while also distributing it into smaller isolated areas. This can lead to genetic drift as these isolated areas will not be connected to the main populations and therefore develop differently. The carrying capacity of these fragmented habitats is also much lower than it normally would be, meaning that an area will support fewer and fewer individuals. This loss of crucial habitat and the fragmentation of habitat puts a lot of pressure on species as conditions grow harsher and populations are reduced. If a species is losing this battle, they will either become endangered or completely extinct, meaning they will disappear completely or be on the verge of disappearing. Urban development also consumes sacred sites or culturally important sites in order to develop them. Aggressive development helps degrade both cultural diversity by consuming these cultural sites and biodiversity by consuming habitat. Keystone species are critical to the health of both culture and ecosystems. They help shape culture through ritual or practice or importance in language, or the ecosystem through behaviors or interactions with other species. There are two types of keystone species: cultural keystone species and ecological keystone species. Out of the two concepts, ecological keystone species is probably the wider known of the two. And one of the most widely known keystone species is the Yellowstone wolf, due to the restoration efforts over the past few decades that have been widely publicized. The wolf, like all keystone species, has a very large impact on its environment. For the wolf, it's mainly through the consumption of large game. This affects the food web by reducing the large game numbers, which in turn affects vegetation and small game. Their impact affects the whole ecosystem by controlling things like caribou in the park. Wolves are an apex predator, which means nothing directly preys on them. The wolf is a great example of an ecological keystone species due to their large and visible impact that has been studied since the reintroduction into Yellowstone. Ecological keystone species can also be plants, like the coast redwood, the forests that create unique habitat for wildlife and other species of plants, by creating shade and moisture and other conditions that dictate the type of life that is able to flourish in that environment. A keystone species can also be defined as a species that dramatically changes the ecosystem that it exists in. Threats to keystone species are often habitat destruction and fragmentation, or cleared areas for agriculture or timber harvesting. Cultural keystone species are species that are vital to the culture of a people. These species are crucial to the cultural identity of a people. These species will be featured in rituals, language, and storytelling, and everyday life. Without these species, the culture would lose a lot of its identity or be drastically different. There can also be culturally significant species that are very important to a culture but not quite on the same level of the keystone species. A culturally significant species may be something that the culture relies heavily on for food or medicine, but may not be a part of rituals or language. Many cultural keystone species have often been used for thousands of years by native peoples, and they have a deep connection and understanding of the species. This is what is called traditional ecological knowledge. The native peoples who have lived in that area have a deep understanding of how that area works, and their frame of reference can be thousands of years worth of passed down information, while modern science has only begun to understand the area. Ecological restoration goes hand in hand with cultural restoration. When doing ecological restoration, it is important to look at traditional ecological knowledge of the area, which will give you the best picture of what work should be done to enhance the area or bring it back to a natural state. Looking at a cultural keystone species is also important, as a species that is culturally significant or a cultural keystone species has been a part of the ecosystem for a long time. It may help prioritize certain restoration actions that will benefit the ecosystem. Prioritizing cultural keystone species in restoration will also help the cultural revitalization and help strengthen local native cultures that relied on the area and the species. This will help promote long-term care of the area and local involvement, which is important for the longevity of the restoration process. Keystone species can also help determine whether an area needs to be preserved or conserved. A species that is a cultural keystone species would need to be used by the people and people would need access to it, which means an area would be more appropriate for conservation of the species. But an ecological keystone species may need to be preserved and have an area saved so it may exist and stabilize without human interference. Creating cultural significance associated with an ecological restoration or conservation project promotes activism and advocacy. This involvement and personal connection that is created reduces the amount of armchair activism as people can be more motivated to take more substantial action. Promoting restoration and connecting it to cultural importance may also help increase the project's momentum and increase its success by getting more people involved in the issues. It will also help promote future related projects while also helping address the reasons that these issues exist in the first place. The more people involved and the more political pressure applied to an issue, the better chance of widespread and long-term change that there is.